Hi, I'm David Morgan,
And I'm Bill Tillman.
and this is Everyday Ethics, where we explore and examine the values that one can use to guide their life every day. Bill, last week we ended talking about worship. We were
Yeah,
looking at the passage in Isaiah 6 where God called Isaiah to be a prophet. Isaiah encountered him in the temple. Isaiah was overwhelmed by this vision of God. And in the midst of the struggles and context of regime change, one of the kings in his life who had led the nation so well had passed away. And now Isaiah is in worship, experiences God, and his life seems to be changed. So let's take it. Let's just start. Let's go back to the scene of that today. And if I remember what follows that vision of God that he had, he realized his own sinfulness and then cried out, woe is me, I'm ruined, I'm a person of unclean lips. And the angel touched his mouth with a coal. And then Isaiah heard a voice, who will go for us? Here am I, send me.
good.
Uh, your thoughts on what actually went on in Isaiah's mind as he was in that overwhelming sense of God's
So you want me to
presence.
be a mind reader? It's for
Sure. Well, we've
well,
well we've talked about Call before, and
yeah,
maybe he has some of the same kind of struggles in that few moments that we've had through the years.
sure. And there is part of the point that what we're trying to address today, that too often this passage about Isaiah is kept as just a solitary reference point when you must put it in the context of the rest of the Old Testament,
Hmm.
all these things that happened before him. You got Moses, um, the Levite tribe that was pulled aside, given the responsibilities of fulfilling the worship patterns of the time. And all of that is put together as a kind of manual for the priests in Leviticus. And once you begin to examine that, you see that we aren't necessarily supposed to be replicating those formats, but the idea of addressing worship, finding ourselves caught up in worship, like Isaiah was. And on through the rest of the Old Testament, there are the examples of people called into some kind of service, usually directed toward how is the worship of God uh, supposed to be put into the practice of the day. But the New Testament, there is Jesus' teachings, and as he walked around and in the style of the time was a peripatetic or walking around kind of teacher. Um, there were those that were called out of the crowds or that would come close to him, and they would sense this, if we want to call it inspiration, not only to live out these teachings of Jesus, but to ask others to consider them. And then with Paul, who is given credit for much of the epistle content of the New Testament, there is a kind of specificity that comes in where the idea of calling um, comes through a congregational setting, so that there's even charge given to the congregation to call out ministers for themselves, but also recognize that there are uh, abilities, there are gifts given for people not only to function in the congregational setting, in ethical ways, but to spread that through their community life as well. Um, all of that began to change and get changed with the advent of Constantine as the Roman emperor. Through him, the Council of Nicaea, he managed to put together a kind of hierarchy of the church, capital C. It reflected a great deal the way the Roman Empire operated. And there followed for centuries the development of what has come to be called the clerical paradigm, meaning authority, decision making was given over to clergy, and lay people were considered subordinate to that.
Hmm.
But it changed, began to change, particularly with the Protestant Reformation. And with people like Martin Luther, especially, there was a renewal toward recognizing not just minister types could be called, but lay people that they were asked to see whatever vocation they go into through the filter of Jesus' worldview. And there have been some interesting quotations that have developed over the years. Some of these I used in class when I was doing classroom work. One, it's a quote attributed to Mark Twain.
Okay.
And of course, the history of these kind of things, you don't know where the quotes come from, but they might be attributed to Mark Twain or Winston Churchill, which are supposed to give substance. But allegedly, the way the quote is profound either way. The two most important days in your life are the day you were born and the day you find out why. And there is encapsulated the idea, what am I called to be and do in life? Now, etymologists, I should say, sorry, etymologists have looked into this and can't find any reason to think Mark Twain said that, but have also come up with at least one additional saying that expands this idea. The three most significant days in your life are: one, the day you were born; two, the day you find out why you were born; and three, the day you discover how to contribute the gift you were born to give. And linking back to Isaiah, David, I think in that passage that we have pulled out now for 2 episodes, all of that happened there in Isaiah's mind. Oh, this is why I'm here. Oh, these are the things I need to be doing. So a very quick overview now of calling and an attempt to pull it into our own time, with Isaiah as a very solid reference point for us to consider.
Okay. Well, one of the things that you alluded to and was, the clerical paradigm, how we moved from basically the recognition that everyone is called,
Mhm.
to the hierarchy among those who are called to something special.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in a congregation that still considered a calling to some church related vocational ministry different and unique and special.
Right.
I mean, that we still believed in the clerical paradigm
Right.
in as late as the 1970s in my congregations. One of the things we've consciously talked about doing, you and me, is to really begin to focus on the calling that every Christian experiences
Yes.
simply by the fact that they know God, they worship God, they've encountered God, and God is going to place some demands. In fact, here's what you said in your book.
Oh,
Truly, one way to understand that one has worshiped is that things change.
hmm.
Expectations upon one become more vivid, and directions for life become plainer. And I'm hoping that in the few moments that we have left today, we can help everyone come to understand that in one's relationship to God, that, as you mentioned, we all discover that gift and how we can contribute that gift to the world. Uh, you also mentioned in your book, you quoted Finley Edge giving three principles to help
Oh,
all of
right.
us.
Yeah.
He wrote, when one discovers her or his calling to a special ministry, that one has a feeling of eureka.
Mm.
And I don't know if he was speaking of special ministry as a church related calling or just something special for each individual. I'd like to think that,
Yeah.
but
Well, the book that I pulled that quote from is The Greening of the Church. And one of the things that Finley Edge was known for particularly um, was his press for more lay theological education. And so that particular section, yeah, it's not only toward those that are going to move into some congregationally related vocation, but any vocation that could bear reflecting the standards of ethical behavior that Jesus taught.
right. Well, I can say from a pastor's perspective, having lay people who understood their calling
Yeah,
in any and every vocation to which they were called was an amazing experience and an
yeah,
empowering
yeah,
aspect for a congregation.
yeah.
So, well, Edge also said, when one discovers her or his calling, he or she dreams about it.
Hmm.
And then when one discovers her or his calling, that person cannot help but to talk about it. And another quote, not in your book, but one that you and I have talked about, comes from Frederick Buechner.
Oh, yeah,
The
yeah.
place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. And that could be in any aspect of everyday
Yeah,
life.
right, right.
You mentioned some Old Testament folks, and you mentioned Moses and the priests.
Yeah.
Uh, One of the things I do teach Old Testament at one of our local universities. I have them fill out this chart on the call and everything that goes along with that. And then, but one of the more difficult things I have to do is which people do I explore the calls for? Because
Okay.
there were many that you could have mentioned. Some of the ones you didn't mention were folks that I would consider lay folks.
Yeah,
I
right.
mean, Miriam. I mean, the ones I'm going to list are women. Miriam, Deborah, and Huldah
Good.
are
Glad you're
three that
picking
just,
up on
well, we're just going
right,
about our daily life, and all of a sudden, God's got a task for us.
right, right.
So, well, now, you also mentioned in your book the idea of spiritual gifts. Was that not one of the things you talked about in one of your questions that you raised? The list of gifts of the Spirit?
Uh,
And you've also
yeah.
mentioned to me, personality profile test. How are those going to help us know when and how we can contribute our gifts?
Oh, yeah. Um, Well, your first thought there, yeah, I did list this. These come at the end of this chapter that we're
Mhm.
exploring in the Integrity Wheel book. But the question, are you familiar with the list of gifts of the Spirit to the church found primarily in those epistles generally aligned with Pauline authorship? Do any of those gifts provide a general reference point for how you might express life? And but I would say generally those provide tone, style, um, basically character reference points for how one would express any vocation. And you can think back to the first century when Paul was writing these kind of things. Um, there were many vocations at the time that they're still contemporary to us. Now, certainly, we've got other things now that are considered vocations that weren't even thought about then, but the basic principles still fit. On the matter of personality inventories, um, and for those that aren't familiar and might be doing this with not familiar with these inventories, some are like the Enneagram personality, Myers-Briggs, MMPI.
Okay.
Um,
We'll list those, by the way, on our continuing the
okay,
conversation page.
and there are others. The point that, and I've tried to make to search committees, for instance, in those congregations that they form a search committee to interview, hire some position of ministry in the congregation. And there are more forms of what we would call pastor of, minister of now, 10 or 20 years ago. But it's always intrigued me how few congregations will pick up on the idea of a personality exam. Now, when I worked for one of the state conventions and worked with the denominational universities in that state, that was a part of our call clarification process for students, that they be involved in some personality inventory. And it has lots of benefits, not the least of which for the particular student. Back to Isaiah 9, or Isaiah 6, and along about verse 9, and you made reference to Isaiah's own self-perception.
Mhm.
Well, he did that without a personality inventory, but that's the point. How much do we know about what's in here? Who are we? What is our being out of which our doing builds? So those two ideas, I hope they can get utilized. Explore the gifts of the Spirit, explore the idea of personality inventories.
I think part of what we're doing today is going to help that because we are emphasizing and highlighting that every person serves God
Yeah,
wherever they find themselves.
yeah, and that needs to be continually covered, recovered. It's time for another reformation, I would say, in that regard.
I think we can probably do that. You know, an acquaintance of mine is a lawyer and is involved with some legal work on local, national basis. And the person was sharing the other day and shared that they saw a clear link between what they were doing and what we might call secular sense, although I'm not real comfortable with the word,
Right.
but in a governmental legal system. But
Hmm.
clearly, everything that the person did, they felt that it was informed by their faith
Yeah.
and their walk with God,
Yeah.
and truly felt they were serving God and called to the work that they were involved in their everyday life and making a
Yeah.
significant difference, I might add.
And I know people like that, and they don't wear the theology, ethics, faith badge on their shoulders, are constantly making theological comments, Bible sounding comments. They've realized, well, in T.B. Maston's words, these kind of things don't divide out either or,
Mm.
but it's both and. That the expectation from Scripture, one that follows Jesus, is that what we say and do on Sundays is the same the rest of the week. That's how we come to be known as someone who reflects values, virtues, character for the common good.
You mentioned T.B. Maston. One of the stories I remember from his life was he was never ordained as a minister, and that was a conscious choice on his part,
Right, right.
which, again, another example of someone who was called to teach, to educate, but did not feel the need to have any special religious
Yeah,
stamp of approval on that. It's what we
yeah,
might
and that's
call, I mean, say what we might call a ministerial calling.
yeah, and that gave him a little more latitude, I think, on where he was invited. He never said that he was a preacher, but he would go somewhere before a congregation and he would speak.
Mm.
And just that vocabulary, uh, well, when you hear him say that, it will give you the pause of, ah, that does have a different sound to it.
Mm.
And he was a very good speaker,
Mm. Yes.
soft spoken, um, didn't get very loud, but his ability to follow up with a train of thought, build off scripture, interpret scripture, and give suggestions for how to apply it, he was a master of that.
Mm. Well, his life and my life took two different directions. I sensed that God was calling me to be a preacher
Okay,
because I was still in that time frame
right.
and was called and felt influenced and mentored by pastors I had when I was a teenager moving into college. They're, they had the kind of personality and character that challenged me and inspired me to to sense that I was being called as pastor
Yeah,
and even now as
right.
executive director of the Maston Foundation. Uh, but I think what they did, I think that would classify them in my mind as heroes.
Ah,
But that's the subject of next week.
and there you go.
And
You
we
made a
need to move
transition
on.
there. Just very good.
So, so until we get together next week, may the two statements from Scripture that we've used before guide us. Jesus went about doing good. Those who follow him should walk as he walked. Thank
See you
you.
next time. Take care.
Everyday Ethics is brought to you by the T.B. Maston Foundation, which seeks to proclaim the abiding relevance of the whole gospel of Jesus Christ and provide support for the study and application of Christian ethics. For more information or to donate, visit tbmaston.org.